fun to be here. I think this is the sixth time, something like that, that we've done a book thing here at the Strand. And just to elaborate on something that Nancy said, that she asked me about earlier, one of the first people that I met here when I arrived in December of 1980 was a man who worked in the rare book room. I guess he ran the rare book room at that time. And the rare book room was about the size of where these chairs are then. But his name was Marvin Mondlane, quite a lovely man. And he told me that he had been at the Strand so long that he remembered when the cash register was a cigar box. And that was it. I mean, and now it's, you know, the basement all the way up to goodness knows where. In any event, let's talk a little bit about these books. It's kind of a different and unique kind of a situation where you find yourself. I mean, I've had a lot of books over the past 40 years or so, beginning in about 1973, but I never had a circumstance where within the space of 1 week, the week of the 5th of June this year, that 2 books arrived at the same time, brand new books. And they weren't supposed to. This one, the Vision Shared book, was supposed to have arrived in January of 2016. No, excuse me, November of 2016. And the Preserving Lives book was to have arrived in November of 2017. Well, obviously they were both late. And the vagaries of publishing books and things like that I don't understand, but it was a treat to have them all arrive at the same time. And what happened was that because they arrived at the same time, I started thinking about them in a different way than I had originally. And my first thought was, wouldn't it be fun to be able to talk about these books together? Because they were both products. I mean, the major action in the Preserving Lives story takes place in the 1930s. And all of them, well, 95% of the action in A Vision Shared takes place between the years 1935 and 1943. And both of the circumstances that allowed for the activity that takes place in these books to happen were products of the New Deal. In the case of Preserving Lives, it was the first New Deal program, which was the establishment of the CCC camps that were all over the country to put out-of-work young men to work, and which enabled my father to get a job. He was at that time he was in the military, and he was a commander of a CCC company that was going to build a park, which enabled him to marry my mother and so forth. On the other, on the Vision Shared situation, welcome, you haven't missed much. On the Vision Shared situation, the Resettlement Administration started a photographic project to document the plight of the rural poor, with the aim in mind of convincing Congress, showing pictures of people in dire straits and so forth, to pass legislation that would help these people. And the Resettlement Administration eventually morphed into the Farm Security Administration. And these people created a archive of, I don't know, 250,000 photographs from the years 1935 until, basically until the war started, when whoever was left in the Farm Security Administration roles were transferred over to the Office of War Information. But created an incredible archive of photographs that to this day are major. It's probably the finest photographic archive of that period that exists anywhere in the world. And it was also the finest group of photographers anybody ever put together in the world. But, so I looked at these two books and I says, darn, I mean, they're all because of the New Deal and Roosevelt. They're primarily because of the 1930s. And it would probably make sense to talk about them together because much of the, and they're pertinent today because many of the difficulties that we're looking at are people who are still mad at Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, who want to privatize Social Security or do something like that. At some point, I mean, in the 1930s, if you can imagine, you had 11 great photographers that worked for the Farm Security Administration, and there were people at that time who not only didn't want that program to go forward, but they wanted to burn the negatives. They wanted to throw all the photographs away because they were, you know, sometimes not very positive. But in any event, let's talk just a bit about how these programs got going. And I know the kind of questions that people have asked about both of these books. And we'll leave some time at the end so that we can talk about all these things. And you can ask me some questions. But let me give you some background on what led to A Vision Shared, which was sort of the first major book I ever did. It wasn't the first, but it was the one that people seemed to like the most. If you can think back, and many of you can't because you're not old enough, but when I came to New York City in 1967, one of the first things I did was join the Museum of Modern Art. It cost $30. And for the $30, you got to go to all the free movies. And when you were on a rather fixed budget like I was, free movies were nice. And they also gave you 2 books a year for free. And one of the books was a book of photographs by about a guy named Walker Evans. It was a good book, and I liked it. Another thing that the Museum of Modern Art had in those years, and I don't know how long it lasted, but it lasted long enough for me to acquire a couple of pictures. They had an art lending service, and you could go up to the art lending room, which was a tiny little space, again, about the size of the chairs here, and for $30, I was able to rent a Walker Evans photograph to put on my wall and keep it for 3 months. And if you liked it and wanted to keep it, you could apply the $30 to the purchase price, which was $100. And so I rented one for $30. I decided I liked it, and I kept it. It's still on the other side of that wall, on the wall. And about the same time, maybe a year or so later, I went to visit a gallery, which was called the Witkin Gallery, which most of you have never heard of. But the Witkin Gallery was the first real photograph gallery in New York City. Lee Witkin started it in about 1969-70, and he was the first. And we got to be friends, and he had a wonderful selection of photographs and books and things like that, and had shows. And he had a browser bin about this deep, and I was going through it, and damn, look, there is a Walker Evans photograph. That's the picture I got. And how much is it? I turned it over, and it was $15. And so I said, Mr. Witkin, I bought one of these at the museum, and it was $100, and yours is $15. Why is this? And he says, oh, well, in the first place, Walker Evans didn't sign this picture. I bought this one at the Library of Congress for $2.50. I gave it to a guy named George Tice, and George Tice washed it and cleaned it and put it on this, mounted it on a little card. And I've got to make some kind of a profit. I had to give George $2.50 to clean it up. So I'm selling it for $15. I can make $10 and pay my rent. And I said, hey, I think I'll buy this one. And I did. And I said, where did you say you got this? And he said, I got this at the Library of Congress. And what I did, I got not the same one that I had, but he had half a dozen different Evans pictures. And I said, I squirreled it away in the back of my head. And I said, that's something I should look into. About the same time, about 1973, I found a book that was called In This Proud Land. And it was a book of these photographs from the Farm Security Administration. And it was a pretty good book, but it didn't tell anything much about the photographers. It just had pictures and an essay. And these were the favorite photographs of a man named Roy Stryker, who was in charge of the Farm Security Administration photographers. And I thought to myself, well, this is terrific, seeing all these pictures, but I wonder about the photographers, who they were and so forth. I knew of Walker Evans because I had the book. In any event, a month or two or through, whatever it was later, I had to go to Washington for something. In those years, I was still a full-time employee of the Central Intelligence Agency, and I had to go down to Washington for things ever so often. But I played hooky one afternoon and went over to the Library of Congress and went to the Prints and Photographs Division, where it was a pretty good-sized room. It was much bigger than the little area with the chairs. And I asked about these things. I said, oh, yeah, they're over there. And here were banks of file cabinets with 4 drawers that you could pull out. And you would just go in and you could look. And they had all of these FSA photographs on cardboard, stuck to cardboard. I don't know whether they were dry mounted or glued or whatever, but they were there, and you could just flip through them. And if you saw something you liked, you could write a number down, and you could hand the number in to the people at the desk, and for $2.50, you could get a Walker Evans photograph from the original 8x10 negative on good paper. If you wanted to pay $3.50, an extra dollar, you could get it on really good paper. And it was, and I was, I thought this was really kind of exciting. So I squirreled this away in the back of my head. In '73, my first book, about a musician named Eddie Condon, came out, and Eddie had died just before it came out, but the editor of the book was very keen on doing something else. And that was at a time when I guess people really ask you to do books, and you didn't have to chase them. And Les said, think up a good project. So a week or so later, I went to him and I said, Les, here's a good idea. I said, I had a copy of this book called In This Proud Land. And I said, look, here are a bunch of really good photographs. They are all in the public domain, which means you can make a book out of them and you don't have to pay anything. This book has many of the good pictures, but it doesn't tell anything about the people who took them. Why don't we do a book that would take the best of the photographs from this project and then, but have the photographers pick them out and deal with the photographers. Most of them are all still alive. So Les said, well, that's a good idea. It sounds like it'd be inexpensive. You don't have to pay any rights for the pictures. And so he talked to a man named Tom McCormick, who was the head of St. Martin's at the time. St. Martin's didn't do picture books. They later made they the company later got turned around because they did a whole series of things called All Creatures Great and Small, and about the veterinarian in Yorkshire. But Les said, look, there are 11 photographers. If you can get 5 of them to work with you, we'll do a book. And I'll get you a budget. I'll give you an advance of $5,000. And I said, wow, $5,000, which was a lot to me at that time. And so I went out to try and sort out finding all the people. And 9 of the photographers were still alive. And I found Carl Maidans in Singapore, and Theo Young in Vienna, and Marion Post-Walcott was in Santa Barbara, and John Collier was in San Francisco, and John Vachon actually just lived up the street. He was here in New York City. Arthur Rothstein was here in New York City. Jack Delano, I found him in Rio Pietras in Puerto Rico. Jack had been sent to Puerto Rico to photograph down there, and he had gone down in like October of '42 or something like that, and they started dropping bombs on Hawaii a couple of months later, and Jack was trapped in Puerto Rico for the rest of the war and basically never came back and stayed down there. Russell Lee was in Austin, Texas, and Dorothea Lange was dead, but I found her husband, Paul Taylor, in Berkeley. And Ben Shahn was dead, but Bernarda Shahn was in Roosevelt, New Jersey, and eager to be involved. And the only person I couldn't find was Walker Evans. And I was chatting with John Vachon one day, and I was bemoaning the fact that I couldn't find Evans, and he says, well, you're just stupid. And I says, what do you mean? He says, well, he's in the phone book. And I said, he doesn't live in New York. I said, yeah, I know he doesn't live in New York, but he's in the phone book. And so I look in the phone, sure enough, Walker Evans, Old Lyme, Connecticut. And I called him, and no, I don't want to talk about that. And I probably called him 5 or 6 times. He was the only person who wasn't eager and enthusiastic about doing this. And finally, he said, okay, come on up here. You're just going to bother me to death if I don't talk to you. And I said, okay. And so I drove up to Old Lyme, Connecticut. He'd given me specific instructions about look for the house at the crossroads that has no windows in the front. Okay, that's a different kind of looking house. So went up there and found that house. And I had borrowed a car from a friend because mine was messed up. This guy's car was also messed up, but not as bad as mine. But the right headlight was held in by Band-Aids. And when I drove into Evans's front yard, literally into his front yard, it was a dirt thing that drove up to the house. I got out of the car, he saw I had a camera with me, an SX-70, and he pointed at the headlight and he said, take a picture of that. And I took up my camera and I said, yes, sir. I took 2, one for me and one for him. If it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. And we went inside and I looked around, and Walker Evans didn't have a single photograph on the wall. He had trade signs, Coca-Cola or some automotive shop or something like that. He also had a square table, about this square, in the middle of the living room. And there were 4 chairs around it, and in 3 of the chairs were fully dressed mannequins. And I'm thinking to myself, where am I? And at one point he says, okay, let's go out on the back porch and talk. And I said, whew, that's a good idea. And we went outside. But as we were going out the back door to the porch, I looked down, and by the door was a pile about this high of records. And the one on the top was, I don't know if it was Fats Waller or Louis Armstrong, but it was a jazz record. And I thought to myself, I'm home free. And the first interview with Walker Evans was him interviewing me. He was just thrilled to talk to somebody who actually knew Jimmy Rushing. I'll bet most of the folks here don't know who Jimmy Rushing, he was a great blues singer with Count Basie's band. And Evans was saying, he is just so wonderful. He says, I was once on a ship with him, but I was too shy to say anything. Okay. Anyway, met all of the FSA guys, worked with them all, and what set this book apart from all the others the one that had been made before, and then the 150 that have come afterwards, is that this is the only one where the photographers had the input to pick out their favorite pictures. This is their choice, not mine. I ordered in probably 450, 500 pictures from the Library of Congress using up my advance. I sent them all out to all the photographers. Pick out the ones you like. If you don't see any that that are your favorites, let me know and we'll order those in. And in many instances, they gave them to me or loaned them to me to use in the book. So it was their choice. Bernarda Shawn picked out the photographs for her husband, and she wrote a wonderful introduction to the book. Paul Taylor picked out the ones for Dorothea Lange, and he wrote a wonderful conclusion for the book. The book came out in 1976, and it came out to great acclaim because you couldn't criticize the pictures. I mean, they were as good as they got. You could say that I don't know how to spell, which was probably true, but you couldn't criticize the pictures, and it generated a whole lot of ink. I mean, there were 3 reviews in the New York Times alone, but there was a big show at the Witkin Gallery, the biggest show Lee Witkin ever had, and if you can believe, he had a vintage migrant mother picture on the wall, which in today's market is 6 figures. I don't know how high 6 figures, but it's an expensive picture. And I think that it was for sale for less than $1,000. And there were inexpensive pictures and things like that. It was really quite a wonderful event. And what it led to the rediscovery of some of these photographers like Russell Lee and Jack Delano and Marion Post. All had shows at major galleries now. It started their careers, jump-started them. They had always had careers, but they now had gallery careers and sold pictures. The book sold out. They made 10,000 of them, and that was that. They never did a second printing because it was the last book that St. Martin's did with hot type. And when it was over, after they made the 10,000 run, they pied the type, and they had nothing else to reprint it with, unless they wanted to make a photographic copy of it. And time passed. And 40 years later, through a series of wonderful events, largely due to a series of books that I've done in conjunction with my friend Ron Kurtz and Gerhard Steidl. Steidl has issued 10 books about Bernice Abbott that we've done. And one of the things, we talked about a lot of different projects when we were working on the Abbott book, and Gerhard was very interested in reissuing A Vision Shared. And as I said, it was supposed to come out in 2016, but there were issues with regard to bindings and all sorts of book things that I don't really fully understand. But Gerhard has made a truly spectacular book. It's exactly like this one, the old one, in terms of the photographs that are in it. But it's about 80 pages longer because Gerhard believes that a photograph should be on a page and it can say, saloon singer, Broken Bow, Nebraska, 1935. But if John Vachon wanted to talk about that photograph, and many of them did, and I love to have photographers talk about their work, and I would copy it down and we'd put it with the picture. He doesn't want to have that underneath the picture because he thinks it detracts from it. So he would put the comments, well, it just happened that I opened one to a Ben Shahn. He would put the comments on a separate page. So everyone that has a long caption has an extra page. Plus, I wrote another chapter for the end of the book that tells the story about what happened after the book was issued. That is, that Jack Delano had exhibits at the Witkin Gallery and things like that, or where we had parties, or I remember Barbara Morgan had a great big do, and Arthur Rothstein assembled almost everybody and set up an 8x10 camera. He had probably 80 or 90 photographers from around New York City come to his house. But one of the most interesting things that happened with the book was that it had, in that year, in '76, there was a show that was on NBC that was Sunday morning, sort of like the Charles Kuralt show is today on CBS, or the thing that morphed from the Kuralt show. But it was called Sunday Morning or something like that. And poor little Vision Shared actually turned up on it, along with Alfred Eisenstadt, Joseph Karsh, and David Douglas Duncan, and me, who, and it was rather sweet because the most famous person there was easily Karsh, and he was the only one who was really nervous. David Douglas Duncan didn't get nervous. He was used to battlefields and people shooting at him, or Picasso throwing paint at him. And Eisenstadt, nothing bothered him. He would sit there on television and said, "I can hold this still for 2 seconds." He'd hold his camera up and he'd click it. But Karsh was sitting and scratching at the edge of the couch. He was nervous for some reason or other. But in any event, that is what we did. We replicated the book as best we could, added a chapter at the end, and the only other extra writing that there was the, I had to write an essay about each year, 1935 or 36 or 37, that kind of thing, and try to put it in perspective to today. And just one additional story about putting that book together. In early 1976, I came back to the CIA office, and everybody was having a fit. And the fit was because I had a telephone call had come in for me from Walter Mondale. And at that time, he was on the church committee, which was investigating the CIA. And everybody just having a fit. Anyway, to make a long story short, what it was all about was I called the number. You can't not call them back. And says, "Oh, yes, Mr. O'Neill. Mr. Mondale would like to talk to you about, well, you know, he's thinking about that Farm Security Administration photo project. Says he'd like to reinstitute something like that, except do it for cities." And I said, "Boy, is that a great idea." And I said, "But why don't you, I'm going to give you a list of 9 names with telephone numbers of the people who took the pictures originally in the 1930s. They'd be much better to testify to Congress than me. I'm just a guy who's written a book." And said, "Oh, would you really do that?" And of course, it never worked out. But so now the book is 40 years later, and maybe it'll have another life for another minute or two. And it was wonderful doing the first version, and the second one was just as much fun. Now, this one has an even more complicated story about how it came about. And I'm not going to mislead you and make you think that this one is significant as this one, because this is merely a Valentine for my parents, based on their scrapbooks from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and early 50s, with a lot of material in it that I didn't even know that I owned. up until maybe the late 70s. But it is, whereas the FSA program was trying to photograph and document the difficulties of the rural poor so that possibly their status in life could be elevated sufficiently so that they could indeed achieve what scholars and whatnot today call the American dream. This one is about two people who were in modest circumstances. I'm from East Texas. I was born in Kilgore, Texas, which is a funny little town in the East, in 1940. They were born in 1910 and 14, respectively, in roughly the same area. My mother was from Tyler and my father was from Dallas. But this is a story about how two people actually did it in those years, working within the framework of the same social conditions that the people in this were working in. I mean, East Texas is not Texas like it's the West, it's the Deep South. In the front of the book, there is a big picture of my father's CCC company, which built a park at a place called Caddo Lake in northeast Texas. Caddo Lake is part in Texas and part in Louisiana. And Caddo Parish, which is just on the other side of the Texas border, is the parish in Louisiana and or the county if it's, the rest of the country. But it had the highest incidence of lynchings of any place in the country. So that's the general location of where these events took place. And the impetus for doing this was the discovery of a couple of scrapbooks, one of which I had known about, this big one. When my father came back from World War II, he was very sick, and he was in military hospitals for over a year. And one of the things that he did while he was there was teach himself leather work. He had to do something. So he made a scrapbook full of pictures of all the wartime pictures. He carried a Leica with him in World War II. So I had always known about that. I hadn't known about some of the other scrapbooks. The primary one was one that I found that had been my mother's scrapbook in the 30s, beginning in 32 and up to 1940. I had actually thought about doing something with it in about 1980 and wrote a little essay and gave it to Jackie Onassis, because at that time there was a book that was very popular called The Diary of an Edwardian Lady, and I was silly enough to think that it might be fun to have a thing that was called The Diary of an East Texas Lady or something. And I knew her a little bit because she was the editor of the first editor on my first Bernice Abbott book. And she was a nice, smart lady. She looked at it, didn't quite know what to do with it, and I didn't either, and I dropped it and put it away for a long time. And then, through a series of peculiar events, I got involved with the Texas Christian University Press. They wanted to do a project. I gave them a list of some things, and this is what they picked. It was not the one that I thought that anybody would, but they thought it would resonate. And there was a peculiar angle to it, in that in 1945, when my father came back from the war, we lived in Fort Worth, Texas, which is where TCU is. And when he came back, he was not quite as tall as I am. He was about 5'11", but he weighed 110 pounds, or maybe 112 on a good day, and was very sick, had to go to the hospital, and they couldn't cure him. And so he wound up being 37 years old with no job, out of the Army, and not very healthy. Now, he did get the medical disability forever and ever, but he had to find a way to earn a living. And the living came back by, at the age of 37, he enrolled as a freshman at TCU. So the university that published this book, they're in the story. They're part of it, which made it rather sweet. And so what I did was I found all of these extra pictures that somehow my mother and father had saved, and I mean, I just opened it here at random. It's the section called the Philippines. My father's job was he was the provost marshal of the 14th Corps, which meant he was the head MP. He was a major, had a company of, I don't know, 300 guys or something. And he had saved the map that they used for the invasion of the Philippines. That is his company, the one they went, where they went in. And I looked at this and I just couldn't believe it, because the map that he saved, that was the map he used to go down the highway to wherever he had to go, was published by Mobil Gas before the war. That's what they had. And if you can imagine going into, you know, quite a fierce battle with nothing but a map from a filling station in any event. But I accumulated all of the stuff that I could beginning in the late teens and sequenced it and wound up with about 540 illustrations and a story, which tracks two fairly, just ordinary people. I mean, they didn't have great backgrounds or anything like that. My father's dad was a carpenter in Dallas. My mom's dad was ran a drugstore in Tyler, Texas. And so it wasn't as though it was starting from a fancy place. But what was nice about it was that it all kind of wound up just right. And that's what this story is, and it's kind of positive. One thing that's very interesting, to me at least, is they had saved all of these things in boxes and scrapbooks and so forth. There was one newspaper that my mother had saved, which was from September 41, and it says, "Report on Nazis stirs South America," and then has the date. And underneath it, there's a thing, headline that says, "Gets Army Call," and it's a picture of my dad, and he's been called to active duty. He was teaching ROTC in the high school in Kilgore at the time. So on the front page of the Kilgore News Herald is my dad, Mussolini, and Hitler. And so I reproduced this one full size, and then on the other page, the facing page, the story that's on the inside where the story about my dad continues, and I wound up with about this much extra space. I said, well, we can't just have a blank space. So I looked through the paper, and what I think is sort of fun, now I told you that this is Deep South, East Texas, and so forth. I reproduced the first two paragraphs of the editorial page for that day. And at that time, in 1941, the people that would be the equivalents of the Make America Great Agains were known as America Firsters. The head guy, actually, Roth just wrote that wonderful book, well, you know, if Lindbergh had gotten to be president and so forth. Well, the editorial in the Kilgore News-Herald is saying that nobody in East Texas is so stupid as to think that these America Firsters have anything to do, that it's important that we do this, it's important that we do that, and Charles Lindbergh can take his stuff and go stuff it, which is kind of interesting because they were a lot more willing to do things in 1941 than possibly in 2018. In any event, this is just a snapshot of the times from a part of the world that at that time was extraordinarily fascinating. What most of you don't know is that tiny little Kilgore, Texas, where this paper was published, and I should point out that the newspaper is still alive and still publishing, except they're down to 2 days a week. And I found out recently that they do a Sunday edition once a year. And happily for me, the book and the story got on the front page of the Sunday edition. The one time a year they do it. But what sets this book apart and some of the activities that are described in it is that in the fall of 1930, 31, something called the Daisy Bradford number 3 came in, and about 2 months later, the Lou Delacrim number 1 came in, and that meant the East Texas oil patch was at least 20 miles long, and a month or so later, they found out that it was at least 40 miles long, and then they built the Big Inch pipeline, and the oil from this field, which at the time was the biggest oil find anybody had found anywhere in the world, provided at least 90% of all of the petroleum that was used by the Allied forces in World War II in Europe. So it was an interesting part of the world where people, whenever you have a town that goes from 700 people to 10,000 in 6 months, all sorts of things happen. They made movies about it and wrote books about it and things, and that's part of this story, and lots of other interesting things that just, I mean, for example, there's a section in here about a guy named Edward T. Kokobaugh. Nobody's ever heard of him. He was my father's favorite friend in World War II in the Solomon Islands. And it turns out that I got to know his son. His son, up until 2 years ago, was the Prime Minister of Fiji. He had risen through the ranks. And the ambassador here in Fiji was a guy named Peter Thompson. And my father's unit had saved his father's unit during the battles in the Solomon. So there's 4 or 5 pages here of all the Fiji fighters who were described to me as and I'll just tell you one story about that, and then we'll give you some questions. The Fiji guys wanted to fight with the Americans, with the American troops. And they say, no, you guys can't fight, you guys are, you know. And they said, well, give us a chance. And they said, well, what do you want to do? He said, we'll attack you. And they said, well, what do you mean? He says, we'll stage a raid on the, you know, the American compound. And they said, okay, when? He says, well, tomorrow night at 2 o'clock. And 2 o'clock came and went, and nobody was there. They got up the next morning, and every place the Fiji guys had been, they marked with a chalk, an X. There was a X on the bottom of every pot and pan in the commissary. There was an X on the bottom of the general's pants, the commanding officer's pants. Needless to say, they got to fight with the Americans from that point on. So, any questions about anything? There is a microphone if somebody has anything. if you don't have any questions, we'll just send you home. And which maybe is what you want anyway. There's one.
So I don't want you to give away any of the secrets from the books, because I'm sure people want to read them on their own. But I'm curious, in a vision shared, do any of the photographers go to the part of the world where your family was? Is there any East Texas documentation
The only
going on?
person who did it extensively was Russell Lee, because he wound up being in Texas. And Russ Lee did a whole lot of stuff in the oil fields, and you can actually find it online. Unfortunately, if you want to buy the Library of Congress photographs now, you can't get them from the negatives. They're all digitized. And you can still buy them inexpensively, but it's not like having a real Walker Evans photograph. I was such a pig. I bought 135 Walker Evans photographs for $250 a piece and kept them all in a binder. And even 250 pictures, they just glowed. They were so wonderful. I got 2 or 3 that were big ones. I mean, you could get a 16 by 20. That cost $10 or something like that.
I mean, Walker went to Louisiana, right? So he wasn't too far away. He was in probably western Louisiana.
He was in Mississippi. He was in Alabama, Hale County, Alabama, where he did all the Let Us Praise Famous Men. But the oil fields were covered by Russ Lee, and covered well. But he didn't pick out any of those pictures. It wasn't my choice, it was his choice. And I never, I mean, in that book, in these 2 books, the famous Dorothea Lange migrant mother is not in there, because that's not the one Professor Taylor wanted to use, and it was his choice. He says, you know, we made 6 of these. I didn't know that. He said, she shot 6 of those that day. And he picked out a different one than the famous one. And as a matter of fact, we used a small version of one of the other scenes that she did of her name was Thompson, the lady who he photographed, or she photographed. And you might not know that story. I mean, what it was about. Lange was going home to Berkeley, and in San Francisco, and she was driving down the highway, and she spotted a camp on the side of the road, and she said, in her some private letters and notes, she said, I just felt that something was going on there, and something pulled me in. And she drove in, and there were, 1,000 or more people there who were basically starving because they had been brought in to pick the pea crop. But there had been an early frost, and the pea crop was frozen. And they were really sort of stuck. And she wound up taking half a dozen photographs of, and they've made a PBS movie about this. There's a PBS film. Took half a dozen photographs and took them with her, processed them when she got home, got them to the newspaper, and they ran a story about it. And within 3 or 4 days, 10,000 pounds of food was delivered to these starving people. And that's what those photographs were to be used for. And some of the pictures in this book, particularly during World War II, were not taken by my dad. They were Signal Corps photographs. I mean, because he's in the picture. There's a picture of Bob Hope and Jerry Colonna and my dad. Clearly, he didn't take that picture. It was done by the Signal Corps. And those pictures like that were to boost the morale and whatnot of the people back home and things like that. So pictures can make a real difference sometimes, I think. And clearly and that lady who was the migrant mother, who was only 32 years old when that picture was taken, I mean, she looked like she'd been around the wash tub one time too often. I mean, she'd had a hard time. She lived into her 80s. She might not have lived to be 33 if they hadn't delivered that food to them. And that's what that program was for. I mean, that was an example of it happening very quickly. Sometimes you were taking those pictures so that there would be legislation to help this person or that, or this program or that. They were hard times, but they were times where folks were actually trying to help people. a lot. Other questions? Here's one.
I've got a three-parter for you.
Okay.
The first is you have such a clear personal affinity for Walker Evans, and you sort of teased us with a few tantalizing details about how eccentric he was.
I don't know. I mean, I guess that's eccentric but it wasn't there. It didn't stay up very long because when Mr. Evans died and John Hill photographed the entire interior of his place, it wasn't there. I wish I had taken a snapshot.
Have you gone on to further research him independently? Have you ever thought about a book just on Walker Evans?
No, not at all, because every person, or certainly every photographer, should have an executor as smart as John Hill. Because John, I mean, he's actually somebody that I emulate, because John managed to get out, I don't know, 7 or 8 or 9 books about Evans, and had all the photographs wind up at the Met, and the negatives and things like that. And the books that he did with half a dozen different publishers are all quite terrific. And when I started working on trying to get all the Bernice Abbott things done, my ambition was to get as much done on Bernice as John had gotten done on Walker Evans. In the case of Bernice, we're at number, let's see, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We've done 10, and there are 3 to go, all with title. And but John Hill covered it beautifully, and a couple of other people did biographical kind of things. And I not only don't write biographies, I don't even read them. So they take too long because they're always this thick. And but there were lots of one story on Evans, which is really kind of nice, is that there's a picture on the back of the book of Evans taking a photograph in a graveyard in Pennsylvania. The photograph was taken by another fine photographer who was with him that day named Peter Sekar, S-E-K-A-R. And one night in 1975, I guess, I was home and the phone rang, and it was Walker Evans. And, Hank, we found that picture. And I said, which one are you talking about? And he says, the one of me taking the picture in the graveyard. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. And he says, I know you want to use that on the book. And I said, yeah, we'll put that on the back of the book. That's great. And we talked for a little while. And I said, how you doing? And he says, I got back from the doctor. Says, I was up making a speech today. And but I'm okay. The doctor says everything is fine. And he says, well, you want to come up next week and so forth and get the picture? And I says, yeah, I'll be up. And so I hung up and went to bed because it was late. It was like 10:30 or 10:45. And the next morning, I'm sitting at my desk and the phone rings, and it's a man named Leslie Katz, who probably none of you ever heard of. Leslie ran a wonderful publishing company called the Eakins Press in the 70s, and it's still quite active, run by Peter Kafias today. But Leslie was all upset because he had done the Evans book, which is probably in the rare section here, called Message from the Interior. And he said, isn't it terrible about Walker Evans? And I said, what are you talking about? He says, he died. I said, what do you mean he died? I said, I talked to him last night at 10:30, and I was probably the last person to ever talk to him. It took us, John Hill found the photograph. Evans had stuck it in a book. And John had was going through everything, and he found the photograph and got it to me, and we used it on the back of the book. But that's a one sort of different Evans story, I guess.
It's a good one. And I was just going to ask.
Is this a follow-up?
This is a follow-up.
Good.
And then I'll pass it on.
Are you with CNN?
I'm not going to get too greedy. If there's been a few other notable artists, novelists who've come out of small towns in Texas as well. have you ever crossed paths with any of them, or have any of them ever responded to preserving lives?
No, it's just out. It's just brand new. The and you see, I left Texas in 1950. I go back to do things like this or to take photographs, but I do not interact with very many Texas writers. I mean, I admire some of them, but I've never really interacted with any of them. But I do go back, and it's interesting because it is so easy to take pictures there because you have a different feeling because of long ago, and it just somehow works. I've been working on a project that will be a survey of US 80 from the Texas-Louisiana border to Dallas. And it's, as I've mentioned to various people, I mean, it still looks like what William Eggleston has in his pictures from the 60s and 70s. Hadn't changed a lot. And that's interesting to me. So, other questions?
We have time for maybe one more, if anybody has one.
Yeah.
This is more about you as opposed to the books.
Shall I leave now?
Yeah, okay. This is more about you, Hank. You've lived a absolutely fascinating life, and I'm curious if you can offer some remarks around your parents' influence, and how it correlates in preserving lives to their life, and how it inspired you, and maybe offer some reflections on your journey from.
That's a good question, and I think that it's important because I think that probably the most important thing that I got from them, which is kind of reflected in the book, is that this was a family from the Deep South. It was not a prosperous family. They were just ordinary. No, I never missed a meal that I know of. May have, but I think that the primary thing that came out from them was that there was absolutely no example that I can think of ever of any racial or religious intolerance. I think that one of the primary reasons from my father's standpoint, and I didn't learn this until I had started working on this book, his first CCC company was to build a park at Caddo Lake. His second was to do a park at Dangerfield, Texas. And the third was to do a thing at a town called Bogota. And I found a picture in a CCC annual of the camp at Bogota. And his 400-man company was all black. And his best pal in the war, who was this guy Edward Kokaba, who was the son of the Queen of Tonga and someplace, but he was also the most important cricket player in the South Pacific and had gone to Oxford and was a brilliant guy. And this led to there was none of the racial stuff that you would expect. And this served me very, very well. I remember one time coming home, I had put together a Count Basie band, and Eddie Durham was the guitar player in it, who you probably never heard of. But Eddie Durham was the first guy who put an amplifier with a guitar and made it, and his amplifier was a cardboard box with a speaker in it. But anyway, I remember coming home to take Eddie to the gig. My father had come home from from upstate New York to visit with me. And both he and Eddie had gotten drunk together because they were both from Texas. Eddie was from San Marcos. But that was very helpful, and the fact that there was absolutely no religious prejudice of any sort. Plus, the house was full of books and music. Everything you could possibly want to read or listen to. My mother listened to light opera, my father listened to Bach and Beethoven, which was unusual given his circumstances. The first time I was given records, and I've done a lot of things in music, the first time I was given records, I was given a copy of the William Tell Overture with Toscanini and Gene Autry singing Wait for the Wagon. So it's quite a spread. But that was the thing, total lack of prejudice and learning all around. I went to my first college class with my father when I was 8 because he had no babysitter. So I would sit in classes of American history at TCU. So, but that's what I mainly got.
You say though he took a Leica with him on the war.
Yes.
Did he get you your first camera?
No, my first camera came from a raffle in Bloomington, Indiana. I remember I was a cabin boy in the premiere of Billy Budd, Benjamin Britten's Billy Budd, and there were 4 of us, and we just loved it because we could smear all this junk all over us, and we were carrying gunpowder and stuff like that. And my mother came to fetch me, and she says, "Oh, by the way, you won a prize, a camera, at the raffle at the local grocery store." I says, "Oh, let's not use it. You can't go in there looking like that." So I had to wait till the next day, but I got a little Brownie Hawkeye, and that was the first camera and the first pictures. They weren't very good. Thank you very much.